Johnologue 2, Depolarizing Within. In the book of Isaiah, chapter 6, verse 11, in what many theologians believe to be a foreshadowing of Christ and his kingdom, the prophet Isaiah says, quote, "The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them." It's from that you get the cliche sort of extra biblical saying that one day the wolf shall lie down with the lamb. And you might think that a little bit implausible, but you might think it a little less implausible if I were to tell you quickly, as I tell you now, that something almost equally unlikely has recently occurred, and that's the fact that Ted Cruz and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez have found some common ground and may actually work together on a important piece of legislation. So maybe the kingdom of heaven hasn't come yet exactly, but a remarkable convergence announced itself on Twitter. Let's see, I think this was May 30th, 2:34 p.m. Eastern Time, after Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had tweeted out something saying that she felt that it should be illegal for former members of Congress to find work as lobbyists. Ted Cruz, polar ideological opposite within the Republican Party and in the United States Senate, obviously AOC is a liberal Democrat, very progressive Democrat. Ted Cruz, a purist sort of libertarian Republican in many respects, said, "I agree with AOC," or so he tweeted. Quote, "Indeed, I have long called for a lifetime ban on former members of Congress becoming lobbyists." At 4:46 p.m. Eastern Time, just a couple hours later, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez responded saying, quote, "If you're serious about a clean bill," talking to Ted Cruz, "then I'm down. Let's make a deal." In other words, responding to Ted Cruz's statement, in Ted's original tweet, he said that maybe this is an opportunity for some bipartisan legislation. Quote, "The swamp won't like it," unquote, but that it would be a good thing for the American people. So that's a pretty striking thing, is it? And I was reading the responses underneath their tweets. It was nice to see that people on both sides, AOC supporters and Ted Cruz supporters, were on the whole pretty enthusiastic about the possibility of those two coming together to sponsor some legislation that folks across the board could agree with. Of course, it was a little bit sad to see some people in the comments suggesting that one should not trust the other and that one should not work with the other because the other is by definition sort of, an irredeemable enemy. But for the most part, even the supporters of these two, I think, very partisan politicians were willing and even excited about the idea of both finding common ground in terms of policy, but maybe even excited about the idea of seeing a little bit of decency in the other person. And that leads me to the focus of this quick little message for you today, which is the importance of depolarizing within. And so, what do I mean by depolarizing within? Well, part of what we do at Better Angels is we bring people together in a context that allows them to sort of speak, to talk about politics, not with an aim towards arguing about politics typically, but rather with a purpose of sort of showing why it is we feel the way we do about politics as a consequence of our own personal experiences and the lives that we have led. And that's what our workshops frequently focus on. But we do focus on something that's even a bit more fundamental than just sort of recognizing the humanity of somebody who's sitting in a room with you. We also wish to get people to focus on actually regulating your own internal conversation so that you're in a position to see the best in another person by making sure that you don't give in internally in your own kind of inner psychological conversation towards the temptation to just sort of think about the other people, the other side, in demonizing or vilifying ways. So Kieran and I, we traveled up to Lynn Benton Community College in Albany, Oregon. I guess it's a little more than a week or so before the recording of this podcast. And we were well received by a crowd of, I guess, about 170 or so students and people from the community presenting Better Angels, talking about our own personal political stories and so forth, and the need for us to restore a sense of shared identity and shared community amongst the American people. Later that night, we rolled out we rolled out a new workshop approach for a smaller group of people, local political officials and facilitators and educators and so forth, called the Depolarizing Within Workshop, and just to share a little bit of what that was like with you guys, because this is kind of a new thing that we're doing at Better Angels. Another program designed by Professor Bill Doherty. We began this workshop, this Depolarizing Within workshop, with a series of questions. So these questions are meant to sort of frame an internal conversation. And so these were some of the questions we read to the folks participating in this workshop. 1, how often do I find myself thinking about, quote, those people, unquote, on the other political side without much regard for the variation among them? Usually we're aware of great variation within our own group. And so that's one question the people participating get the chance to circle often, sometimes, or never. Here's another question. How often do I find myself assigning mainly self-serving or negative motives to the other group, and mainly positive motives to my own group? People participating have the chance to answer this on a sheet of paper, circling often, sometimes never. Just going through a few other questions here. How often do I find myself comparing the worst people on the other side with the best people on my own side? How often do I feel a rush of pleasure with friends when we ridicule those crazies on the other political side? How often do I find myself focusing on the most extreme or outrageous ideas and people on the other side, thereby making it hard to see how a reasonable person could remain in that group? And so these are just sampling of some of the questions that we ask people to ask themselves in this workshop. And you get the point of it, right? There's a pattern to polarizing thinking that causes us to think in terms of caricatures and generalities with respect to the way other people are, and with respect to the other way with respect to the ways that other people think, that prevents us from being able to see the nuances and the viewpoints and in the experiences that ultimately yield the points of view that other individuals have. And so we have in this workshop, we went through various means of sort of challenging these internal modes of thinking that we frequently embody. One is challenge your stereotypes, and so we ask people to sort of look for the ways in which people tend to fall outside of the raw and ugly caricatures that the media and other disseminators of political illustration have us think about each other. So blues tend to believe that, for instance, even thinking in a polarized mind frame, if you're a liberal or progressive, blues tend to think that reds are racist, anti-immigrant, uncaring about those in need, homophobic, anti-woman, anti-science, intolerant Bible thumpers. Reds, on the other hand, conservatives in a polarized frame of mind, tend to think that blues are arrogant, elitist, favoring big government for its own sake, lazy, fiscally irresponsible, unpatriotic, hate America, hate religion, intolerant and sensitive snowflakes, perhaps of the campus variety. what are some ways to counter this type of stereotyping in your own thinking? That's part of what we went into in this workshop, and part of the answers that we give are to tell yourself that the other side is more varied than the stereotype suggests. Acknowledge that their political views and motivations are no doubt more complicated than the rhetoric you've been hearing, even out of the mouths of some of the other side's leading politicians, perhaps. Read and listen to thought leaders on the other side who present complex arguments. Recognize that the life experience informing their views are likely different from your own. Develop relationships with a variety of people who differ with you politically. And if you want to go out, you can work to develop an understanding of the history and current strands of thought on the other side of the aisle. Of course, you need a little bit of time for that one. But that's some of the advice that we give to people in the context of these workshops, and then we invite people to brainstorm some of their own methods and techniques for possibly getting outside of that polarized framework. So these are all little bits of advice that you can feel free to take with yourself, but to sort of zoom out again from that a little bit. All of these sorts of techniques that we're developing are really just sort of ways in which we can act upon a more fundamental philosophical assertion. And that is the idea that ultimately there is some inherent human worth and some inherent human dignity in our fellow man and in our political opponents. And that it's something that is vital to remain mindful of, both for the sake of maintaining our own personal sanity in the context of a highly divided and highly sort of toxic political world, but also it's vital to do so as to allow us to actually create the circumstances from which genuine social and political progress might be accomplished. And so one thing that I tend to go back to in the context of sort of establishing this philosophical principle and demonstrating to people the proven power of it is, and you've heard me go back to this point in history before, but it is the efficacy of the nonviolent philosophy in demonstrating love as a social value. The example that Martin Luther King Jr. set in the civil rights movement as a vessel for love as a transformative social force was one that provides for us a pathway today for the restoration of a shared sense of American community, something that goes beyond the divisions that present themselves to us in our partisan context. But to do that, or the substance of that philosophy, requires us to recognize the human worth of one another. And so I think it's relevant to point back to some of the philosophical themes of that movement and talking about how it is we can and why it is we need to transcend even an inner conversation with ourselves that has a tendency to demonize and vilify people on the other side of the aisle. And one of the things that's relevant to say about that is the fact that, oftentimes we feel like there's something unfair about the need to, or about being asked by someone like myself, for instance, to focus on seeing the humanity in people who, whether we are Democrats thinking about Republicans or conservatives thinking about liberals, that we should be asked to see the humanity in people who we feel are mistreating us. That seems unfair to the victim in some sense, right? And Dr. King was very clear in saying, and now I'm reading to you from an essay entitled "The Ethical Demands for Integration." Quote, King says, quote, "I cannot conclude without saying that integration places certain ethical demands upon those who have been on the oppressed end of the old order." Now, in talking about integration, Dr. King is not talking about the overturning of laws that prevent people from, say, black people from being able to sit at the same lunch counter or go to the same bathroom or attend the same school as certain other white folks. But King is rather talking about a sort of a more earnest and heartfelt merging of community across racial lines and really across any sort of line of division. In saying that it places certain ethical demands upon those who have been been oppressed, King is pointing to the fact that it requires us to love our oppressors. A very difficult thing. And why would we do that? King goes on to say that the nonviolent technique is double-barreled. It, quote, exalts the personality of the segregator as well as the segregated. And in this, what King is pointing to is this power that love has to allow us to speak to the best in our opponent by dropping the worst in ourselves. In other words, it allows us to, quote, thwart the, quote, growth of bitterness, unquote, within ourselves. He goes on to say that in a very large measure, nonviolence has helped to diminish the long repressed feelings of anger and frustration, unquote. Love, applied in a social context, allows us to relinquish the burden of hatred and bitterness and frustration and anxiety and fear that we feel because of and towards those who have mistreated us in a social context. And ironically, allows us to diffuse some of these impulses in the minds and in the hearts of our political and social opponents. And so that's a powerful thing, and it's a foundational sort of discipline to cultivate within oneself in the context of going forward into this divisive and nasty sort of political environment with the intention of being a light in the context of conversation and political organization for other people to follow. And so, yes, embodied love is a social value. Depolarize within. And maybe if we do so, we'll come to a point to where the lion really can lay down with the lamb. And seeing folks like Ted Cruz and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez actually treating each other like human beings and doing business together for the common good of the American people won't seem like such a rarity or uncommon sort of thing. So until next time, this is John Wood Jr.